Yeah, so this is just basically the title of the presentation, 20 years after 9/11, the long-term impacts of the 9/11 attacks on Islamist terrorist movements. I think the very first thing that we need to discuss, and it feeds largely into what Mitch just presented us, is that as far as understanding jihadism, it's very important to understand that the local feeds the global and the global feeds the local. We like to say that all jihad is local, but at the same time, it's actually a transnational global movement. And that's what makes it so potent and powerful, particularly in an era of interconnectivity and an ability to build identities that supersede and overcome the nation state identity that we've grown accustomed to. The recent developments in Afghanistan couldn't happen at a worse time. In 2004, when we invaded Iraq, and the narrative in our mainstream press was that they were fighting us because of our democracy and human rights, bin Laden issued a very carefully calculated message where he stated that it was not, in fact, the human rights and democracy that they were fighting us for, that it was because we were fighting them. And then he painted a very, very unnuanced perspective that appealed to many people around the globe about the so-called atrocities of Israel, US in Somalia, US in Chechnya, in Iraq with sanctions. And he tried to qualify terrorism as something that was correlated to the Quran. But what that really did was it set forth this division between the global and the local, that at the same time, jihad could be global and local. And then he talked about the policy of bleeding America to bankruptcy. He said that we, alongside the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, bled Russia for 10 years until it went bankrupt and was forced to withdraw and defeat. And then he stated that we are continuing this policy in bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy, Allah willing, and nothing is too great for Allah. So now, as we approach the 20th year anniversary of 9/11, we see that in the minds of jihadists, this long-term game and the war of attrition, which was also adopted, the narrative of ISIS changed in the last speech of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He called it the war of attrition to tap into his idea that ISIS was the continuation of bin Laden's sentiment. But where we find ourselves at now is we have a vision that ultimate victory is for the Muslims that will now impact the mind and the mentality, not just of jihadists, but of Islamists, and makes that very real argument that only violence jihad can attain the change that radical Muslims want to achieve all the more palatable. And it will bleed into the understanding of prophecy and the resonance of ISIS trying to take over from the Taliban there, because the statement of jihadists, they hold Khorasan in Arabic as Afghanistan. And the prophecy says that the black flags of jihad will be raised in Khorasan and will not be stopped until it reaches Jerusalem. So in a matter of months and really weeks, we have seen what was in the minds of jihadists basically a state of despair, that ISIS's caliphate has been dismantled. It looked like there was no concern for jihadism relative to power state competition. They weren't in the media, they weren't in the press. All of the chatter that has happened since then, I've seen jihadist chatter online in Arabic particularly go up at least 8 to 10-fold, I would estimate, although that's not an empirical number. So what we're dealing with is a situation where at each local level, jihadist units are forced to choose between allegiance to either the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. And so what we've also seen in the development over the last 20 years, when ISIS or the Islamic State in Iraq transitioned into the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham or Syria, we saw that unfolding of the beginning of a jihadist competition for the allegiance to Al-Qaeda, which had shifted more toward a populist approach. Let's moderate the message, give it to them piecemeal. We have opportunities with the vacuum that's created in Syria. Let's not destroy our relations with the civilian population vis-a-vis ISIS Puritans, who, of course, don't care. Everything has to be rigid. If they're not implementing Sharia law in its totality, then they are not, in fact, Muslims, and essentially brandishing anybody that didn't agree with them as kuffar or disbelievers that needed to be have war waged against them. But what we really see happening with the Taliban's rise is we have an ability for Al-Qaeda to claim again the mantle of transnational jihad, while at the same time playing a role in what's going on in Afghanistan, because contrary to popular belief, the impact of Al-Qaeda, particularly on the messaging and the development of the propaganda that the Taliban has issued over the recent decade in particular has drastically improved. And it's also a strategy with regard to when we look at the Haqqani network, for example, which housed Al-Qaeda for years, fought alongside of them in Afghanistan, and is probably helping to house a lot of Al-Qaeda leaders. When we look at that situation, we can see strategy that's much in line with the way Al-Qaeda thinks, because they're much more strategic. For example, on August 6th, approximately a week before the Taliban took back Kabul or came to overrun the entirety of the country, craftily, just in the same way that it was done on September the 11th, the Taliban killed Dawa Khan Menakul, who was the media chief in Kabul. And immediately thereafter, Zabihullah Mujahid, who we now know his face, we now see him speak, and he's now, active on Twitter and Facebook and all of our social media accounts. The spokesman for the Taliban began to stream Taliban propaganda in Kabul for the week before they just took it sort of without a fight. This is exactly what the strategy of Al-Qaeda was on 9/11. They knew that Ahmad Shah Massoud was going to present a populist leader that could basically become a counter to the Taliban that had popular Afghan support. So bin Laden sent Afghans with a video camera pretending to be Western journalists, and it was actually a suicide operation. The camera had a bomb in it, and they blew up their competitor. By doing this with and understanding the role of media, we certainly see indications of Al-Qaeda's influence, but Al-Qaeda has this different approach where they believe that it is not numbers that matter. It's not populism. It's quality that can influence populism. So what they do is they send specialists, experts in Islamic law, experts in strategy and bomb making, fundraisers, and that might only be a handful, but they can drastically impact any arena that things exist in. However, when we talk about the future and what the future of the transnational threat in the jihadist milieu is going to look like, we have to consider the fact that what we've seen with regard to the reaction of ISIS, the killing of 13 American service members, the planned attack yesterday that was luckily thwarted with some controversy behind it coming out in the press, is that when there's jihadist competition, or when in general, the literature on terrorism movements and what happens when two extremist elements go to war, begin to combat each other, is actually contrary to what people would believe. It actually benefits both groups. So this has been true throughout history, especially amongst nationalist and religious groups. It does not necessarily apply to the far left, but it's something to consider, because ISIS's claims for their constituents as a result of the attack will be that, you see, we are still upon this Puritan path, and you can see the fruit because we're still attacking Americans. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are working alongside of the Americans. And that's the narrative that is formulating. And it is resurrecting a lot of chatter, a lot of support, and a lot more interest in even ISIS's propaganda. Whenever terrorist groups outbid with each other, we always talk about looking at the quantity of violence in the literature. But I think what we also have to think about is the quality of violence, because when you look at when two terrorist groups start to compete and combat with each other, technically it is the competition for publicity and press, right? It's not about how many terrorists don't care about how many people they kill. They care about how many people are watching, essentially. And so it's the high profile attacks, the quality of the attacks that go up. And in an era where we've gained some sort of, I guess, limited concern and concentration in the aftermath of a lone wolf attack, it is those high profile cases that can propel a group like ISIS in Khorasan to the limelight, taking away something from the Taliban's messaging. And so we're going to see a massive ideological war between jihadists everywhere. And when you talk about the intersection between the global and the local, this has an impact, because we've already seen in the aftermath of the civil war that started in Syria between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, we've already seen all of the smaller jihadist organizations working around the world have to essentially pick a side between them. And so going forward and thinking about, what the future is going to look like, we have to look at the recent rift between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but we should also remember a past rift that we did not pay attention to. Bin Laden's plan was to attack the far enemy. And the objective of attacking the United States was so, in the belief of his strategy, they could not take on the Arab authoritarian regimes and reestablish a khilafah with a power like the United States, able to intervene and to arm the Arab authoritarians that they want to actually overthrow. in many minds of jihadist strategists, the far enemy strategy is no longer appropriate. It's no longer needed. The United States is an empire in decline for all of the reasons that Mitch stated. They look at it as a non-interventionist policy. They look at Central Asia as now being controlled by the Russians, China and its Belt Road Initiative getting ready to become expansionary, and they're now mostly focused on the local. And so the real issue that we have coming forth is whether or not there is going to be a major threat from Taliban, Al-Qaeda for attacks abroad in the US and in the West and generally. There certainly will remain a threat from ISIS supporters. In fact, that will be a priority because now the narrative is that Al-Qaeda and Taliban are working with the United States, whereas they are continuing to fight the Americans and continue to pursue the far enemy strategy. But this is something to end with. It's very similar now, the conditions in Afghanistan with the Taliban coming to rule, and they will definitely continue their PR campaign because in order to govern, they need help from Turkey, they need help from Qatar, they need foreign powers to support them, and they're doing a good job. And most people are thinking that the jihadist milieu, Al-Qaeda supporters, all of the transnational jihadists that are not necessarily concerned with nationalism will give up on them. In fact, anybody who has watched the shift in Al-Qaeda's strategic approach to populism knows that they will be incredibly supportive because we're going back to an era where in the aftermath of the Afghan-Soviet jihad, you had arguments amongst jihadists, and bin Laden took the perspective that you needed to attack abroad, that you needed to carry out terrorism attacks, whereas Abdullah Azzam, a populist, took the perspective that we should proselytize and send people to preach the religion and to establish an ability to overthrow the regimes. We're standing back into a situation like this, where the jihadist milieu will start to figure out exactly how they can attack in the Middle East. And we are in a very difficult situation because there's no appetite for foreign intervention and we have to recalibrate and we don't have the influence that we once had. In a long story short, to end, I mean, we really do have to understand the limitations of military might. I think as a result of the first 20 years of the war on terror, we've recalibrated, focused on power state competition, and we're planning on removing ourselves from a heavy counterterrorism presence. I think what happened in Afghanistan is evidence that we have to do one and the same at the same time. And in order to effectively combat and to win military wars, to win any type of competition with a nation state or a non-state actor, we have to better understand the ideas and the ideological struggle. We have to, rather than combat who the extremists are or who the authoritarians are, we have to really start to get our mind around how can we mobilize support for a vision that is about individual liberty, democracy, and that counters the extremist message. There's some items here on this final slide. I know I'm hitting time, but a lot of the work that we do now is in an effort to sort of try to take back some of that narrative and to create holistic approaches to facilitating that. We're working on partnering with an organization called Ideas Beyond Borders to get that message into Afghanistan now. But long story short, it's really, really important to understand the ideas and the way that ideas intersect with identity today, and to come up with actual mechanisms that can combat them at a strategic communications level, and then even domestically at a preventing and countering violent extremism level. Thank you very much.